I think we're ready to get started this morning. Thank you for being here. Please begin to take your seats if you're not seated yet. Thank you. Welcome to this committee of the Energy, Utilities, and Communications. This is an oversight hearing on Proposition 39. In November of 2012, the voters approved the Clean Energy Jobs Act, or also known as Proposition 39. The act closed a corporate loophole, a tax structure that was hotly a contested issue. It was a key negotiating element in the 2008-2009 budget that led to a very strange situation in which corporations were able to use a tax loophole, choosing a tax calculation method that was more favorable to them. When I arrived here in 2010, there was an effort on behalf of our caucus to close that tax loophole. That was taken to a vote several times, but it never passed. The ensuing endeavor was to put a proposition on the ballot that voters approved by 61%. This was expected to have a result of raising revenue for the state anywhere from $800 to $1 billion. That's what it was estimated. That's what we estimated that this tax loophole cost the California state budget. Proposition 39, again, was passed overwhelmingly by the voters. It closed this tax loophole by mandating that corporations determine their California tax liability using the single sales factor and no other method. What's more, Proposition 39 dedicated for 5 years that half of the revenue generated by the use of the single sales factor was to be used in projects that create jobs in California, improving energy efficiency and expanding clean energy generation. In 2013, the legislature enacted measures to implement Prop 39. The resulting statute dedicates the bulk of Prop 39, 89%, to K-12 education, with the remainder, 11%, dedicated to campuses of the California community colleges. The funding is to pay for energy efficiency and clean energy generation projects that benefit our schools and our students, including significant upfront planning and consultation to ensure schools make the best use of their Prop 39 dollars. In addition, the legislature has repeatedly made one-time allocations for technical assistance and job training. The statute gives significant administrative roles to several state agencies, including the Chancellor of the California Community Colleges, the California Conservation Corps, the California Energy Commission, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and the Workforce Development Board. The purpose of today's hearing is to better understand the roles and activities of the various administrative agencies and their interrelations. It's to assess the progress in developing energy expenditure plans and in dispersing revenue to K-12 schools and community colleges, and to assess the progress in implementing energy-efficient projects and clean energy generation measures, as well as the adequacy of upfront project assessment and after-the-fact review to ensure achievement of project goals and the goals of the Act. To help us with achieving our goals, we will hear from a number of witnesses today, including Jason Cisney, the Chief Deputy Analyst for the State of Local Finance with the Legislative Analyst's Office. He'll discuss the taxation changes made by Proposition 39 and the resulting revenue effects. We will have representatives from the California Energy Commission, the Department of Education, and the California Community Colleges, who will help us understand the process for reviewing and approving projects and school sites and for dispersing Prop 39 funds. We will have representatives of the California Conservation Corps and the Workforce Development Board who will discuss their roles in providing technical assistance to schools and workforce training and development, as well as in the case of the workforce, the WBD, its methodology for estimating the job creation effects of the Act. Arno Harris is a member of the Proposition 39 Citizens Oversight Board. He will discuss the board's role in reviewing expenditures from the fund and assessing the effectiveness of Prop 39. And of course, representatives of several school districts from throughout the state who will discuss their experiences planning for and implementing energy efficiency measures and clean generation. And last but not least, there'll be an opportunity for the public, for members of the public, to comment on their own experience, their own thoughts, or their own opinions. It is the intent of this committee to recognize to review and recognize the successes in the implementation of Prop 39, as well as any possible shortcomings, any possible problems. If there are legislative remedies needed to this implementation process, this will also be an opportunity for us to discuss those as well. Before we get started, I'd like to extend the mic to any members of the committee if they want to make any opening comments at all on this issue or any thoughts or concerns. If not, we will begin with our first panel, and this will be overview with Jason Cisney. He's the Chief Deputy Legislative Analyst in the state and local finance arena within the Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome. Good morning. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to give a very high-level overview. I'll mention at the outset that, this type of discussion spans several areas of our office. My colleagues who cover, for example, energy policy are back at the office working on the large amount of work we have this time of the year reviewing the budget. And so if you have questions, I'll do my best to try to answer them, but in some cases we might have to try to get back to you after the hearing. And in many cases about detailed implementation issues, I'm sure that the later witnesses will be much more equipped to answer some of the questions. We have a handout, and I'll start on page 1 right after the cover. This deals with the corporate tax, which I know from a number of years discussing it is a very complicated topic, and it is not easy for ordinary people to understand how it works. It's our third largest general fund revenue source. It is among our more volatile sources of revenue, along with capital gains and the personal income tax. The corporate income tax, where we tax corporate profits, goes up and down with the fortunes of a relatively small number of corporations. This is a tax that is highly concentrated among large corporations who pay it. These tend to be multi-state, multinational corporations who pay the bulk of the tax. And with the most recent data, for the overall corporate tax, about 0.4% of corporations filing returns pay around 3/4 of the tax. And what we're talking about here today with Prop 39 is really just a relatively small sliver of that very concentrated tax. A key thing to keep in mind with this policy is what we call apportionment. And the corporate income tax apportionment is basically how multi-state and multinational corporations attribute their profits and their income to particular jurisdictions. So if you have a company that operates all over the country, our tax code has to have a way of saying, well, what part of your profits are going to be taxed by the state of California or the state of Connecticut or some other state? For most of the last few decades, California and many other states have had an apportionment method that considered the percentage of a company's sales, property, and employees here in California. It was sometimes called a 3-factor formula or a 4-factor formula. It gets pretty complicated. But the point is it considered all of these things. Going on to page 2, before Proposition 39, you may remember that we had a lot of changes in corporate tax law as the state's budget situation deteriorated. In general, these were short-term measures that were designed to help the budget during the recession. And in a number of cases, these short-term measures to help the budget in the near term, in essence, reduced revenues in the long run. That essentially was the design of some of the pretty complicated policy changes. Among those changes was a February 2009 action where the state of California changed its corporate apportionment to something called the optional single sales factor. And what this did, it said that starting in 2011, corporations filing these tax returns could choose which apportionment method to use, either the traditional method that looked at sales and property and employees, or they would have the option of choosing the single sales factor, which looked at just the portion of their sales that happen in California. The effect of this choice was to reduce ongoing state general fund revenues. It was estimated by, actually it's estimated now, by well over $1 billion a year. That is, if that policy had remained in place, we would have lost over $1 billion per year in state revenues compared to what the law was before February 2009. On to the next page. That measure, that action caused a lot of controversy, and it helped lead to proponents and members of the legislature suggesting a change that eventually became Proposition 39. And Proposition 39 changed apportionment rules yet again, and it required multi-state companies in general to use the single sales factor. So we call it the mandatory single sales factor. And that's California's law today under Proposition 39. The mandatory single sales factor, according to the current estimates, partially but not completely offsets the loss of revenues that the February 2009 action that I mentioned earlier created. It increased state revenues by hundreds of millions per year compared to that optional single sales factor. On to the next page. Our office, we were quite open about it in 2009 and 2010 and 2011. We recommended the change to a mandatory single sales factor policy. We found at the time that the optional policy that was created in February 2009 created some problematic incentives for some companies. And at the time, we described how the optional single sales factor, the policy in Prop 39, could give some California-based companies better incentives. The optional single sales factor, the policy that was passed in February 2009, rather. One of the problems with that policy is it could give some California companies a problematic incentive to expand into other states rather than expanding here in California. And we also described how some California-based companies could receive a relative tax advantage under the policy Proposition 39 eventually put in place. So we found that there were a number of benefits for the state's economy and for California-based companies from pursuing the mandatory single sales factor policy that eventually became Prop 39. This is still relatively early in the implementation of this complex policy. And I think that over time, the legislature and the executive branch, and for that matter, academic researchers will want to study the benefits and costs of this policy. Developing that data set to really understand all of the pros and cons will take time, as it does with any tax policy. And it's something that the legislature might find some benefit from exploring as time goes on. Lastly, and this is very simple, and a lot of what the rest of the panels will be talking about, is that Proposition 39 dedicated half of its estimated new revenues up to a maximum of $550 million per year for energy efficiency projects and alternative energy. And that goes through 2017-18. The other new revenues, including all the new revenues after 2017-18, go to the State General Fund. These energy efficiency projects, by and large, have been, the funding for these projects, by and large, has been appropriated to schools and community college districts, with some other smaller pots of money going to some other entities that you'll hear about. With that very broad overview to set the table, happy to take any questions if you have any.
Any members? Senator Leyva?
Good morning. So I want to understand the single sales factor. Have you determined that it did pose was it problematic for companies, and is it better for them to operate out of California or stay in California? I feel like the language is a little bit,
It is confusing.
Okay.
And I think that part of it is that we had a policy in 2009 called the optional single sales factor, and then we
Right.
changed it under Proposition 39 to the mandatory single sales factor. The concern that we and others raised was that the optional single sales factor, now the old policy, created a problematic incentive for California-based companies, some of them anyway, to expand out of state. Our analysis found that the mandatory single sales factor policy, what came into place with Prop 39, helped alleviate some of those problematic incentives. Essentially, one of the key problems with the old policy prior to Prop 39 is that companies really had a choice. That was the design of the policy. And it meant that basically they could take advantage of what they were allowed to do under the tax code. And in some cases, that meant that it could benefit them to expand out of state rather than here. With mandatory single sales, it creates essentially a more level playing field. And what California taxes on is based on the percentage of a company's sales. Essentially, all multi-state companies are selling products in California. Our market's that big. And so what Prop 39's policy tries to do is to take note of that and essentially create what we found to be a more level playing field between in-state and out-of-state companies. I will just say, as I mentioned, this is something for researchers to consider in future years. Did that pan out as we and others expected? And I think that, that probably is an open question.
that was very helpful. Thank you.
So it was an effort to level the playing field, but that effort to level the playing field also raised the revenue that we're seeing coming in now, which you mentioned in some instances is in excess of over $700 million a year.
That's correct. During those roughly 2 years or so that the optional single sales factor was in place, some companies were allowed under the tax law to reduce their tax payments. And what this measure did is it essentially changed that law so that some of those companies and others pay more taxes, and it partially offsets the loss from the optional single sales factor.
So you have a method of measuring this and calculating how much revenue resulted from the change in the law?
It's a very difficult process. Tax records are kept, and they're kept confidentially by the Franchise Tax Board. We in the Department of Finance and legislative committees, we rely on their estimates for very detailed tax policies like this. And so efforts have been made to keep those records, to estimate those revenues every year, and that's one of the processes that determines how much clean energy money goes out to schools and community colleges.
So how close are the estimates?
The estimates are now lower than they were to begin with, and I think it's important to be open about that. At the time, in the ballot guide that we produce and it's mailed to all registered voter households, we estimated that the change of Prop 39, compared to the law then in place, would raise revenues about $1 billion per year. The estimates since then have been lower by a few $100 million.
Well, can you say to what level of certainty can you say that money was raised by Prop 39 tax code?
I think it's fairly clear that revenues went up because of Prop 39, but the challenge has been determining just how much. And I think that the latest estimates we see for 15-16, the current fiscal year, for instance, from FTB, show that instead of raising about $1 billion, it's raising something closer to about 780. A notable change, a notable increase, but definitely somewhat less than we and FTB and the administration expected at the time the policy was in place. I think that as we think about our work in ballot measures in a year like this, where there'll be tax measures on the ballot, it really is something for us and others to keep in mind that estimating tax revenues, be it from capital gains or this type of tax, there is a margin of error. And I think that we probably can do a better job with others of trying to communicate that to the legislature and the voters.
Okay, very well. Senator Wolk?
Thank you for trying to explain mandatory and optional single sales factor. As someone who was here during that time, it was also a product of a two-thirds vote for the budget, and all sorts of ugly things happened in the middle of the night, and this was one of the ugliest. It is to the pro tem's credit, he voted against it. He was one of the few people who voted against it, and really made this sort of a, I wouldn't say a crusade, but sort of a an effort to gather outside folks to put something different on the ballot, and that was Prop 39, which is an amazing factor in itself because it was a major, I mean, if it's confusing enough here, and was to most of us, you can imagine taking that to the ballot and then being successful. So I think the pro tem deserves a lot of credit, and those that helped him and his allies to do that, because frankly, it was bad policy. It was a good lesson about not doing things in the middle of the night that involved complex taxes. The reasons had to do with the two-thirds vote and the terrible budget situation we were in. Not necessarily a good excuse, but frankly, an imperative. So thanks for your explanation, Jason. And the fact that the LAO was so strong against this, I think is a tribute to your independence, and hope that continues for a very long time. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Cisney. Thank you very much for being here today. We're going to do a panel change here and move on to the implementation process to date in our K through 12 schools, and ask Rob Oglesby, the Executive Director with the California Energy Commission, to please come forward. And should we do Peter at the same time here?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. If you could give us just a few minutes to get our PowerPoint up.
Not a problem.
Are you ready? You can sit here or there. Here's a clicker. That'll work. So it looks like we are ready with our technical side of the presentation.